Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, ministers, members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to present you with some early G20 history, and then to look ahead a bit as a background to today's discussion. As Ambassador Aranda just mentioned, effectively the G20 began in many ways with the recognition by the G7 following the peso crisis in 1994 that the G7 could no longer operate as an independent entity, expecting that their own economies would not be affected by economies outside of the G7. At that point, Canada was in a rather difficult financial situation. We had a very bad balance sheet, and the peso crisis, in fact, drove our interest rates through the roof, as they did some other countries. I then went to the G7. I was a G7 finance ministers, and essentially suggested that a new body should be created, a parallel body to the G7, that would effectively bring in countries like Mexico, China, India, Brazil, and a number of others. The Mexican peso crisis was of relatively short duration, and there was very little interest at the G7 to do it at that time, and the idea died. However, 2 years later, the Asian crisis occurred, and the Asian crisis was one that was far more serious, in fact the most serious financial crisis since the end of the Second World War, up until the most recent crisis in 2008. This was when a number of Asian countries, beginning with Thailand, was borrowing short from the United States, lending long in Thai baht, and the net result was that when the Americans and the depositors started asking for their money back, reserves in countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Korea started to plummet, and the Asian crisis really began a set of contagion that ultimately led to the Brazilian devaluation, led to, in part, I suppose, to the default by the Russians, and ultimately to the failure of long-term capital, which really shook the world's major financial capitals. At that point, having failed in front of the full G7 with the earlier one 2 years ago, I went to my counterpart, Larry Summers, and essentially said, look, something's got to be done. The G7 simply cannot deal with the reality of the world's economy as it is. Larry agreed, and within a very short period of time, we sat down and essentially did up the list of countries that was going to make up the G20. I've been asked since then, obviously there must have been extensive studies. Well, there were no extensive studies. We simply sat down and took a look at the countries, and it didn't take a stroke of genius to understand those countries which were going to have a major effect on the global economy. You will notice that the organization is called the G20. There are only 19 countries. It has been said that that's because neither Larry nor I could count. In any event, actually, one newspaper wrote something that I thought was really quite offensive, but nonetheless said, well, for a finance minister, what's another country? But the fact of the matter is that following that, the G7 finance ministers then were set up and they met. About a decade later, I became Prime Minister, and felt that the very reasons that Mexico, Brazil, China, India, and other countries had to be part of what was the Leaders' Summit to match what we finance ministers had done. I met with the Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao the day before I became Prime Minister, put the idea to him, which he shared, and at that point I then met with all of the leaders of the G7 countries and the countries that had made up the G20, and suggested to them that a parallel organization to the G8 be created, as the finance ministers had done. All of the leaders of the countries that I approached, with the exception of one, supported the idea, and that was President Bush. Neither said yes, nor did he say no. So, to make a long story short, the whole issue was put in some abeyance, and then subsequently from that I stepped down from government, which is a euphemism for saying I lost the election, and began working with a number of people. Ambassador Rosenthal who was here, Ambassador Lourdes Aranda, who was here, Angel Gurria, who many of you know. The Mexican foreign policy experts played a tremendous role in building up the intellectual content from among a number of G20 countries that eventually meant when President Bush, and I congratulate him for it, called for the G20 leaders to meet in Washington, there was that intellectual construct. As you know, then since Washington, there have been a succession of meetings leading up to what is going to be the Los Cabos Summit, probably the most successful of all of those meetings, although I think that the Korean meeting was very successful as well, was the London Summit. The London Summit, which, as you know, is the one that stopped the wave of protectionism that was beginning to come into place as a result of the crisis. So, capsule form, that is the history. The question is, where does the G20 go from here? Now, the answer is, I believe, that the G20, having demonstrated that it can respond to crises, the London Summit being the example of that, the issue now is, can the G20 prevent crises, or at least can they prevent crises that can be anticipated? Now, I believe the answer to that question is yes. In any event, that will certainly be the case if the G20 members are able to essentially address the issues that President Calderon outlined before Christmas in what I thought was a very forward-looking speech on the Mexican summit. Among the issues that he addressed were food security and infrastructure, climate change, and the global financial architecture, and I'd like just to make a couple of personal comments on each. On food security and infrastructure, my view is what is important is not only to recognize the individual issues, but to recognize the degree to which they are interrelated. For instance, only last week, some of you may have seen that the government of Tanzania announced that there was a food crisis in the north of their country, despite the fact that there was a bumper crop in the south. And this occurred because Tanzania's internal transport links are totally incapable of getting food from one part of the country to the other. Now, dealing with development issues of this kind was an initiative of the Korean Summit. It was one that France picked up on, but my own belief is that nonetheless, nothing has happened on it. And I think that this is one issue in which Mexico could very well be the catalyst. This is also an example how deep-seated change in the G20 is not going to occur immediately, but will occur over a number of summits, and it's important to bear that in mind. On climate change, Mexico showed great leadership when it hosted the Cancun Summit. Unfortunately, the successor conference last month in Durban, as you know, was not quite as successful. Now, hopefully, those countries, each and every one of which is a G20 members that are resistant to dealing with climate change, will recognize that unless the G20 sends the right signals, then in fact, the chances of keeping global warming within a target of 3% growth, let alone the UN's target of capping it at 2%, are nil. Now, we shouldn't kid ourselves. The UN may have the responsibility to achieve agreement on climate change, but over the next 5 years, I believe this is going to be one of the G20's greatest challenges. The third issue which President Calderon raised was the global financial architecture. Here, President Calderon, in the context of the current European crisis, talked about the benefits of looking back at the experience of others. And in this case, he cited Latin America's experience in the 70s and the 80s. Picking up on the President's lead, that is to say, of learning from the past, I'd like to refer to an experience that the G20 finance ministers, and I do this primarily as a result of what Governor Carstens said in his remarks earlier, and it's the reason I'm doing this. I'd like to pick up on an experience that the G20 finance ministers and central bankers went through a decade ago when we created the Financial Stability Forum, and failed to give it substance. And my hope, and certainly encouraged by what Governor Karsten said in his earlier remarks, my hope is that the current generation of officials who created the Financial Stability Board don't make the same mistake. And let me just explain. 10 years ago, at the time that the G20 was created, the G7 ministers came up with the idea of creating this Financial Stability Forum as a way of having central bank governors and regulators talk among themselves in order to prevent banking crises, which are, as we've now seen, the worst kinds of crises you can have. The problem is that the G7 would not have a banking forum to deal with this issue that had any more members than the G7 members and 2 or 3 other Europeans. They would not give it any authority. They gave it barely any staffing. Now, people ask, why is it that we had the crisis in 2008? Well, one of the reasons, I believe, is that the body that was set up by the G7 to deal with this was a body that was simply understaffed and did not have the authority. When the G20 was created at the leaders level, China and India and other countries came in, they insisted that in fact the membership of the Financial Stability Forum, now become the Financial Stability Board, had a membership that was wider than simply the G7, that it be the members of the G20. With respect, I think that that's showing the same kind of myopia. Because to have a body that is going to deal with banking crises internationally and limit it to 20 countries, and to say that Malaysia, as an example, or Chile, as an example, is not going to have banking problems is simply short-sighted. I believe that there is a real opportunity at the Mexican summit to really do what Governor Karsten said, which is to consolidate the evolution now of the Financial Stability Board. And I'm going to come back to this, because I think that there is a magic moment here. The current head of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, was the former head of the Financial Stability Board. The current head of the Financial Stability Board is the Governor of the Bank of Canada. I think there's a real opportunity here, and I think it's the kind of thing that we should do, build on the mistakes of the past. Now, 4 brief comments that I'd make on the G20, underpinning its role in preventing crises as opposed to simply responding to them. The first comment speaks to what the G20 should be, and that is a network of nations seeking to bridge the gap in the global issues that are facing those nations. Now, if you agree with that definition, then I also expect you'll agree that the meetings of the G20, including its summits meetings, should be informal, that they should be the kinds of discussions where the leaders can engage in a give and take between themselves. Now, unfortunately, this is not always the case. Indeed, what we have in too many instances is an excess of pomp and circumstance. Now, there are 2 reasons for this. The first is that the time for these meetings is simply too short. Take a look at what's happened with most G20 meetings. Really not much more time, time for a supper the night before, and the next day, a session of the leaders jammed in between a photo op in the morning and a press conference in the afternoon. And that is too short. These are the most important multilateral meetings of the year. And I think that we have to give the leaders the time to deal with them. The second reason, I think, for the lack of informality, the lack of give and take in these meetings, is the absurd size of national delegations. Now, the reason that I'm going to get out of here right at noon is that I'm probably going to offend some people, so forgive me, but when you read that it takes thousands upon thousands of hotel rooms to hold a meeting of some 25 or 30 people, something's wrong. And it shows up in the casts of hundreds upon hundreds who wander upon the site while summits are being held. What all these people do, no one will ever know. But let me tell you, no wonder some leaders simply read their speeches as opposed to engaging in debate. And no wonder it really has been known that some leaders have gotten up in the middle of these meetings and wandered off never to return. That being said, I understand that capping the size of delegations is not going to be easy, that a lot of countries are going to oppose this. But I just would say to you one thing. Over the course of the last 10 years, because it was the same problem at the G8 meeting, I have talked to the leaders of the countries who have brought the largest numbers of delegations. In most cases, most of those leaders didn't know how many people they were bringing with them. They sure as heck didn't know what the cost was, and they couldn't answer me what the heck most of those people were doing. So I think that this is something that has got to be worked on. It's not going to be, you're not going to be able to solve it at the next summit, but I do think it's something that has got to be dealt with over time. My third point in terms of crisis prevention lies in the importance of focusing the public mind on what the G20's purpose is and why summits are important. Now, as I mentioned, in an increasingly interdependent world, the world in which we all live, the role of the G20 is to seek to make globalization work not simply in terms of the response to a crisis, but over the longer term. Now, I raise this again because it is not unusual after a summit for the press, for commentators, to criticize the results because the leaders fail to resolve immediately whatever issue happens to be the flavor of the month. Often, in fact, instead of recognizing that the kinds of issues that are on the G20 table don't lend themselves to instant success, a summit will deem to have been a disappointment, or it'll deem to have been a failure because of a lack of compatibility of the G20 members, and this is deemed to be a flaw, the fact that these are different countries, when compared to the so-called harmony among 7 of the 8 G8 members, about which I will refrain from commenting. Part of this is true, by the way. The G20 is not a club of compatible economies, and learning to work together has not been easy. It's an ongoing process. But when you see how difficult it is for the European economies to reconcile their differences, you can imagine how much more difficult it will be for the G20 to do so. The G20, which is crisscrossed with far greater cultural, historical, political, and economic differences among its members. But this is not a flaw, and this is really important as the press or as any of us judge the G20. The differences between G20 members are what made the G20 necessary, because that's the reality that the world has to contend with. That's the challenge that the G20 has to rise to. As we all know, the unipolar world is over. Increasing multipolarity, rising Asia, rising Latin America, soon to be followed by Africa, is the order of the day. And while the progress that has been achieved by the G20 may be slower than we would have hoped, you can imagine the flailing about that would have occurred if the G20 had not been created. And this brings me to conclude, Madam Chairman, on what I believe should be the G20's overriding priority in terms of both crisis response and crisis protection. This is the priority in which I think the G20 should ultimately be judged as a success or a failure. And that is its ability to strengthen the great global institutions. The fundamental issue that we face today is contagion. Financial contagion, climate change contagion, pandemic disease, transnational crime, you name it. Whatever it is, no nation can deal with contagion alone. The only answer to the spread of global risk will be found in the strengthening of the institutions required to make globalization work. The United Nations and all of its agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, and this is why I feel so strongly, as obviously does Governor Carstens, about the Financial Stability Board. Nobody expects the leaders to sit around debating the details of financial, and the Minister Foreign Affairs and I were talking about this earlier with Lourdes. Nobody expects the leaders to sit around talking about the details of financial regulation, but they do expect the G20 to deal with it. And the only way in which the G20 can deal with it is to strengthen the Financial Stability Board, where people have got the capacity and the time to do it. With every passing day, in every facet, our world becomes more and more interdependent, more and more integrated. There are huge benefits that flow from this. But we better understand as well that the threat, the risk of contagion flows from that as well. Contagion, which in an increasingly multipolar world poses a greater and greater challenge because there is no longer one superpower that can forge a consensus. There's no longer one superpower can set the world upon a direction, whether the world wants to engage in that or not. Much of the responsibility that was held by the superpower as catalyst now falls to the G20. But the implementation of what the G20 decides will fall to the global institutions. One example, take a look at what happened in Europe. When the Europeans, unable to monitor the Italian deficit plan, had to turn to a global institution, the IMF, in order to do it. Well, that's what's going to happen more and more. So it's for this reason that I believe that strengthening the global institutions must be uppermost in the G20's collective mind. And I don't think this is going to be easy, because it's going to require an unprecedented sharing of sovereignty, which is in turn why the G20 summits are not simply another date on the leaders' calendar. For only national leaders can make the sovereign trade-offs that will be called for. And only leaders can explain at home why these trade-offs have to be made. Fundamentally, only leaders can explain that why it is that in today's borderless world, the only way to protect sovereignty is to share it. That's why the G20 is important. And that's why its summit must be the catalyst for action. And on that, over to you, Ambassador.